In 1961, America had exactly 15 minutes of spaceflight experience. 15. That's how long Alan Shepard's little suborbital hop lasted. And from that starting point, NASA landed 2 men on the moon in just 8 years. Fast forward to today, and 4 astronauts aboard the Orion spacecraft are circling the moon right now as part of Artemis II, the first crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit since 1972. It took over half a century to get back to this point, and nobody has actually landed yet. So what happened? How did the country that sprinted to the moon with slide rules and duct tape turn into one that spent over $93 billion and still hasn't put boots on the lunar surface? That's exactly what we're going to break down. Let's start at the beginning. May 25th, 1961. President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made one of the bold promises in human history. He said the United States should commit to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely before the decade was out. At that point, America's total manned spaceflight experience was Alan Shepard's 15-minute flight just 20 days earlier. Kennedy was basically standing at the starting line of a marathon and promising to win the 100-meter dash. But there was a very real reason for the rush. The Soviet Union was terrifying the entire Western world. They launched Sputnik in October 1957. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth on April 12, 1961, beating every American into orbit. The Bay of Pigs invasion had just failed. Kennedy needed a win, and he needed it on a stage so big that nobody could argue with the result. The moon was that stage. He asked Vice President Lyndon Johnson to find a space goal where America could decisively beat the Soviets, and Johnson and NASA came back with one answer: the lunar landing. And then Kennedy doubled down. On September 12, 1962, he stood at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The money Congress poured into NASA was absolutely wild by today's standards. At its peak in 1966, NASA's budget consumed 4.41% of the entire federal budget. To put that in perspective, today NASA gets about 0.35%. Back then, that translated to roughly $42 billion a year in today's money. The total Apollo program cost about $25 billion in 1960s dollars, which works out to approximately $309 billion adjusted for inflation. Over 400,000 people worked on the program across NASA and roughly 20,000 contractor companies. And here's a detail that always gets me. The average age of the flight controllers in mission control during Apollo 11 was just 27 years old. 27. These were basically kids flying humans to the moon. Kennedy never saw his dream come true. He was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. But the program kept surging forward. The rocket that would carry astronauts to the moon, the Saturn V, was being built under the direction of Wernher von Braun at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And this thing was an absolute monster. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall, which is over 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. Fully fueled, it weighed 6.2 million pounds. Its 5 F-1 engines generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. It could haul 310,000 pounds to low Earth orbit and send nearly 96,000 pounds toward the moon. Across 13 launches, it had 12 successes and 0 crew fatalities. For a machine built in the 1960s, that safety record is honestly insane. But tragedy hit before anyone left the launch pad. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were inside the Apollo 1 command module during a launch rehearsal test at Cape Kennedy. A flash fire erupted inside the cabin. The spacecraft used a pure oxygen atmosphere, was packed with flammable materials, and had an inward opening hatch that took 90 seconds to open. The 3 men had no chance. The Apollo 1 fire killed all 3 astronauts and forced a 21-month halt to the entire program. It was devastating. But here's the thing that's hard to say out loud. That disaster probably saved the program in the long run. It exposed lethal design flaws before they showed up in actual space. NASA redesigned the spacecraft from the ground up, and every crewed Apollo mission after that returned its crews safely home. The program ramped up fast. Apollo 8 in December 1968 sent Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders around the moon, making them the first humans to ever leave Earth orbit. William Anders captured the famous Earthrise photograph, showing our planet rising above the lunar horizon. On Christmas Eve, the crew read from the Book of Genesis to a global audience. The whole world was watching. Then came the big one. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin rode the lunar module Eagle down to the surface of the moon, while Michael Collins orbited alone above them in the command module. Armstrong had to manually steer around a boulder field near the landing site, and when the Eagle finally touched down in the Sea of Tranquility on July 20th, they had roughly 25 seconds of fuel remaining. 25 seconds. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong stepped onto the surface and said the words that would echo through history, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He and Aldrin spent about 2.5 hours outside on the surface. And then there was Apollo 13 in April 1970, the mission where everything went wrong. An oxygen tank exploded inside the service module about 200,000 miles from Earth. Commander Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes used the lunar module as a lifeboat, while Gene Kranz and his team in Houston Mission Control improvised solutions in real time to bring all 3 astronauts home alive. They made it. It's still one of the greatest rescue operations in human history. The final Apollo mission, Apollo 17, launched in December 1972. Commander Eugene Cernan and geologist Harrison Schmitt spent over 22 hours outside across 3 moonwalks, drove the lunar rover farther than any previous crew, and collected 243 pounds of lunar samples. When Cernan climbed back into the lunar module on December 14, 1972, he was the last human being to stand on the moon. And as of today, over 53 years later, that's still true. So with all that momentum, you'd think going back would be the easy part. But here's where the story takes a frustrating turn. After Apollo ended, America pivoted to the space shuttle program. Going back to the moon fell off the national agenda. George H.W. Bush proposed a lunar return in 1989 with the Space Exploration Initiative. It was canceled under Clinton. George W. Bush launched the Constellation program in 2004, Obama canceled it in 2010, and pivoted to an asteroid mission. Every time a new president came in, the plan changed. The moon kept getting pushed further away. Then on December 11, 2017, President Trump signed Space Policy Directive 1, officially redirecting NASA back to the moon. The program was named Artemis on May 16, 2019, after Apollo's twin sister in Greek mythology. Vice President Mike Pence set an aggressive target of landing astronauts by 2024. That deadline was never realistic. And here is why. Artemis is not trying to do what Apollo did. Apollo was a sprint. Fly there, plant a flag, grab some rocks, come home. Artemis is trying to build something permanent. The goal is to establish sustainable infrastructure at the lunar South Pole, extract water ice for fuel and life support, test technologies for eventual Mars missions, and create a lasting human presence on the moon. These are wildly more ambitious objectives. The first real milestone was Artemis I, which launched on November 16, 2022, as an uncrewed test of the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion capsule. Over 25.5 days, Orion traveled 2.3 million kilometers, entered orbit around the moon, and flew farther from Earth than any spacecraft designed for humans had ever gone. Sounds like a perfect success, right? Not quite. When Orion came back through Earth's atmosphere, engineers discovered that the heat shield had cracked and eroded in over 100 locations. Chunks of the protective ablative material had broken away during re-entry. The investigation into what went wrong consumed over a year and pushed everything back. Which brings us to right now. Artemis II launched on April 1, 2026, carrying the first humans beyond low Earth orbit since Gene Cernan left the moon in 1972. The crew includes Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, who became the first person of color in deep space, mission specialist Christina Koch, who became the first woman beyond low Earth orbit, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, the first non-American ever sent into deep space. On April 6, they completed the lunar flyby, passing within 4,067 miles of the surface and setting a new human distance record of 252,756 miles from Earth. That beat the old Apollo 13 record by over 4,000 miles. As of right now, they are on their way home with splashdown planned for April 10th near San Diego. The big question everyone is watching is whether the redesigned re-entry profile will protect the heat shield this time. That is a genuine white-knuckle moment. Now let's talk about the rockets, because this is where things get really interesting. The Space Launch System that launched Artemis II actually produces more thrust than the Saturn V. SLS Block 1 generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, which is about 15% more than Saturn V's 7.5 million. It's the highest thrust crewed rocket ever flown. But here's the catch. Despite having more raw power, SLS can only send about 27,000 kilograms toward the moon. Saturn V could send nearly 43,500 kilograms, almost double. The Saturn V had a more efficient staging design that squeezed more performance out of less thrust. And the cost difference is brutal. Each SLS launch runs about $4.1 billion. A Saturn V launch, adjusted for inflation to today's dollars, cost about $1.49 billion. So SLS costs almost 3 times as much per launch while delivering half the payload to the moon. That's not a great trade. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, hit subscribe. I cover space, science, and the stories behind humanity's biggest projects every week. Now here's where 2026 really shook things up. Jared Isaacman, the billionaire who commanded the Polaris Dawn mission, was sworn in as NASA's 15th administrator in December 2025, and he immediately started making big moves. First, the Lunar Gateway space station that NASA had been planning for years was effectively canceled on March 24, 2026. Isaacman announced that NASA would pause Gateway and redirect those resources toward a $20 billion 7-year plan to build an actual base on the lunar surface. International partners like the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency had invested years developing Gateway hardware, and they were not thrilled about this sudden pivot. Second, Artemis II was demoted. Instead of being the historic first lunar landing, it's now going to be a low Earth orbit test mission, similar to what Apollo 9 was back in the day. The crew will dock with one or both commercial landers from SpaceX and Blue Origin and test the new Axiom spacesuits, but they won't go to the moon. That mission is now targeting mid-2027. The actual first crewed lunar landing got pushed to Artemis IV in early 2028, with a second landing on Artemis V planned for late 2028. And third, the more advanced versions of the SLS rocket were canceled entirely. No Block 1B with the bigger upper stage. No Block 2. After Artemis V, NASA plans to transition to commercial rockets like SpaceX Starship or Blue Origin New Glenn for future lunar missions. Speaking of SpaceX, the Starship human landing system is one of the biggest question marks in this entire program. SpaceX holds contracts worth up to $4.5 billion to develop the lander version of Starship. The catch is that Starship HLS needs somewhere between 10 and 14 tanker flights to refuel in orbit before it can head to the moon. That means NASA needs SpaceX to perfect orbital propellant transfer, a technology that has literally never been demonstrated before. Through early 2026, Starship had 2 back-to-back explosive failures in early 2025 and hasn't flown yet this year. Elon Musk said on April 3rd that the first flight of the new Block 3 version is 4 to 6 weeks away. Whether all of this can come together in time for a 2028 landing is anyone's guess. Blue Origin is the other major player. Their Blue Moon Mark 1 cargo lander was undergoing thermal vacuum testing at Johnson Space Center in Houston as of February 2026, with an uncrewed lunar demo flight planned for 2026. The crewed Mark II version, contracted at $3.4 billion for Artemis V, has a demo flight targeted for 2027. So why is all of this taking so much longer than Apollo? 5 big reasons. The first and biggest reason is money. During Apollo, NASA had 4.41% of the federal budget. Today it's around 0.35%. Apollo spent roughly $42 billion per year at peak funding in today's money. Artemis averages about $6 billion per year. Casey Dreyer at the Planetary Society summed it up perfectly when he described the difference between funding a race you have to win versus funding a casual stroll that turns into a jog. The total Artemis spending of around $93 billion sounds massive, but it's actually about a third of what Apollo cost in today's dollars, spread over more years with far more complex goals. Second, political continuity disappeared. Apollo had unbroken presidential support from Kennedy through Nixon, driven by existential Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Artemis has survived 4 different administrations with completely different visions for space. Every transition brought cancellations, restructuring, or reassessment. The current administration even proposed cutting NASA's budget by 24% and retiring the SLS rocket after just a few flights. Congress overrode those cuts, but the constant instability makes long-term planning almost impossible. Third, the goals are incomparably more ambitious. Apollo landed 2 astronauts in a small lander at easy equatorial sites, stayed for a few hours or days, then left. Artemis is trying to land at the lunar South Pole, which is much harder to reach, build permanent habitats, extract water ice, demonstrate Mars-bound technologies, and keep humans there for weeks or months at a time. Every additional system adds complexity that Apollo never had to deal with. Fourth, NASA's relationship with risk completely transformed after tragedy. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986 killed 7 crew members. The Columbia disaster in 2003 killed 7 more. Those losses fundamentally changed how NASA makes decisions. Modern NASA quantitatively models the failure probability of every component. When the Artemis I heat shield showed problems, the agency chose a full year-long investigation over just pressing forward. That kind of caution would have been unthinkable during Apollo, where schedule pressure regularly overrode engineering concerns. A March 2026 NASA Inspector General report found that the agency still lacks the ability to rescue stranded astronauts from the lunar surface in a worst-case scenario. They're working on it rather than ignoring it. And fifth, contractor economics actively work against speed. The SLS was built under cost-plus contracts, meaning Boeing and other companies get reimbursed for all their expenses plus a profit margin regardless of overruns. NASA's Inspector General found that Boeing received 89% of available performance bonuses during the 2013 to 2017 period, despite billions in cost overruns and years of delays. SLS was originally supposed to fly by 2016 and cost around $10 billion to develop. It first flew in November 2022 at a development cost exceeding $23 billion. The system is designed to spread funding across congressional districts, not to build rockets efficiently. One more thing that blows my mind about this comparison. The Apollo guidance computer, the machine that navigated humans to the moon, ran at about 2 megahertz with 4 kilobytes of RAM. Your smartphone is roughly 120 million times more powerful. A basic graphing calculator has more computing power than the system that landed on the moon. Apollo's engineers achieved the impossible with impossibly limited tools. And yet here we are, with technology that would look like magic to those Apollo engineers, and we still can't get back to the lunar surface. Artemis does have genuine advantages, though. The Orion capsule is bigger than the Apollo command module, carries 4 astronauts instead of 3, and can support its crew for up to 21 days versus Apollo's 12.5. Autonomous flight systems, redundant computers, advanced materials, and real-time global communications give Artemis capabilities that Apollo could never dream of. But the workforce tells a different story. Apollo had over 400,000 people working on the program. NASA's current civil servant workforce has dropped to around 14,000, its lowest since before Kennedy's 1961 speech. About 1 in 5 NASA employees left in 2025 alone, the historic single-year loss in the agency's history. So where does all of this leave us? The immediate test is Artemis II's re-entry on April 10th. If the heat shield holds and the crew splashes down safely near San Diego, it validates everything NASA changed after the Artemis I scare and clears the way for the Artemis III orbital test in mid-2027 and the historic Artemis IV landing attempt in early 2028. But there's a new factor in the equation. China has announced plans for a crewed lunar landing by 2030. That competitive pressure is real, and Isaac Mann has explicitly framed Artemis around beating China to permanent operations on the moon. Whether that pressure translates into sustained funding and political will is the open question. The deeper lesson here goes beyond rockets and budgets. Apollo proved what a focused democracy can accomplish when it commits national resources with singular urgency. Artemis reveals the much harder challenge of sustaining that commitment across decades and changing administrations while pursuing goals that are legitimately more ambitious than anything Apollo attempted. Apollo asked one question: can we get there? Artemis is asking a much harder one: can we stay? The answer is still being written. And right now, 4 astronauts hurtling back from the moon at 25,000 miles per hour are the ones writing it. If this breakdown gave you a new perspective on the space race, old and new, drop a subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.